Okay, it's good to see everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about whether or not you can hear, whether or not you can fulfill your obligation by hearing the Megillah read over Zoom. And this seems like a very sort of contemporary question. Certainly, it's been it's became a more pressing question first last year, right when Purim fell just as the pandemic was beginning. At the time, I think most shuls were still having in-person services, except actually Haya's parents' shul in New Rochelle. Haya's parents were already in quarantine at the time of Purim last year. But then this question about whether or not you could fulfill your obligation to hear Megillah by listening to it over Zoom became more pressing. But in fact, actually, all the way back, we'll see sort of pretty early in the 20th century, the question of whether or not one could fulfill their obligation by hearing the Megillah read over, not Zoom, but over telephone or the radio came up. And basically, we're going to also see in the sources that obviously, because of the technology advances that happened in the late 19th, early 20th century, this was in many ways a totally new field. So there are a couple of sources in the Gemara that that the poskim deal with, but then everything else we look at tonight is going to be an opinion that was written by a 20th century posting. So let's look at the two or three important sources from the Gemara that poskim talk about when they talk about this issue. So the Gemara in Sukkah describes the synagogue that existed in Alexandria in Egypt. So it says it was taught in a Braita that Rebbe Yehuda says, one who did not see the great synagogue of Alexandria of Egypt never saw the glory of Israel. They said that its structure was a large basilica with a colonnade within a colonnade, so a very grand structure. At times, 600,000 men in it, twice the number of those who left Egypt. And there was a wooden platform at the center, and the sexton of the synagogue would stand on it with scarves in his hand. And because the shul was so large and the people could not hear the Shliach Tzibor, when the Shliach Tzibor reached the conclusion of a blessing, of a bracha, that people were supposed to answer Amen to, the Gabbai, as it were, would wave his hand, wave the scarf, so that if you were sitting all the way in the back and you couldn't hear the Shliach Tzibor said, you were still able to answer Amen. And does anyone want to hazard a guess as to why this might be relevant to our discussion?
No microphones.
Okay, yes. So maybe it's that they didn't have microphones then, and maybe in some way that means we can't have microphones now. But which is definitely one way in which this Gemara could be read. The other way in which it could be read is that in some way it sounds like there's an interplay going on between the Shliach Tzibor and that person sitting all the way in the back who answers Amen. And even though he didn't actually hear the Shliach Tzibor's voice, he didn't hear the Chazin's voice, he's still able to participate or get something out of the service in some way by answering Amen, it seems. So that's another aspect to this Gemara. Let's take a look at two more sources before we get to the contemporary poskim. So the Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah talks about sounding the shofar. And it says if one sounds the shofar into a pit or into a cistern or into a large jug, if he clearly heard the sound of the shofar, he's yotzei, he's fulfilled his obligation. But if he heard the sound of the echo, he has not fulfilled his obligation. And similarly, if one is passing behind a shul or a house, or his house was next to the shul, and he heard the sound of the shofar or Megillah Esther being read, if he focused his heart, that is, if he had the intention, if he had kavanah, that with that sound he would be yotzei, fulfill his obligation, then he's yotzei. But if he hasn't had that intention, he hasn't fulfilled that obligation. He has not fulfilled his obligation. So that here the Mishnah is saying, right, you can't just hear this sort of by happenstance. When you hear shofar, you have to, or Megillah Esther, you have to have in mind that you're fulfilling the mitzvah of sounding the shofar or reading the Megillah by listening to it. It is therefore possible for two people to hear the shofar blast, the Mishnah says, and one of them fulfills his obligation, and one of them doesn't. Even though this one heard and also that one heard, nevertheless, one focused his heart, one had kavana, and one did not. And because one didn't, a person didn't have in mind that they were going to fulfill their obligation, then they did not fulfill their obligation. So this source gets read in sort of an interesting way. On one level, it seems like this might have nothing to do with Megillat Esther and Zoom, because here, if you tune into Zoom, presumably you have in mind that you want to get some. If you watch the Megillah being read on Zoom, presumably you do have in mind that you want to be getting something out of that reading. So what beyond that, does this Mishnah have anything to say to us? Maybe not. And whether or not it does actually is the subject of some dispute. And the question here is that when the Mishnah at the beginning of the at the beginning of the Mishnah, no, this isn't Rebbe Yehuda. When at the beginning of the Mishnah, it says that you have to hear the pure sound of the shofar and not an echo. Is that also true about the Megillah? And if we hear the Megillah being read over Zoom or the radio or the telephone, are we hearing the pure sound, or are we hearing something more like an echo? So those are the two questions that come out of this Mishnah for the postscript. And this Gemara is related to that Mishnah. We'll just go through it quickly. That it was taught in the Mishnah, if one sounds a shofar into a pit or into a cistern, he has not fulfilled his obligation. Rav Huna said they taught this only with respect to those standing at the edge of the pit, those on the outside, as they can only hear the echo coming from the pit. But those standing in the pit itself have fulfilled their obligation, since they first or initially hear the sound of the shofar. And this is also taught in a Braita. If one sounds a shofar into a pit or into a cistern, he has fulfilled his obligation. And then the Gemara asks, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah that in that case he has not fulfilled it? Rather, it says, isn't it correct to conclude from here that the contradiction must be reconciled in accordance with Rav Huna? And the Gemara concludes, indeed, we learn from here that this is so. Some had a different version of the previous passage. There were those who raised, there should be an ellipsis after the question mark. There were those who raised the following source as a contradiction. We learn in the Mishnah that if one sounds a shofar into a pit or into a cistern, he has not fulfilled his obligation. But isn't it taught in a Braita that in that case he has fulfilled his obligation? Rav Huna said this is not difficult. This is not a difficulty. Here in the Mishnah, we're dealing with those standing at the edge of the pit, whereas in the Braita, we're dealing with those standing in the pit. So this Gemara sort of adds something to the Mishnah also, which is, does it make a difference how close you are, let's say, to the action that you're listening to? How close you are to either to the shofar blower, or as in the example in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, or maybe how close you are to the Megillah reader, to the Baal Koreh. Because another part of this question is, can you use a microphone when you listen to the Megillah? And perhaps,
Rabbi, I have a question.
Sure.
They don't raise the issue that the shofar is midoraita and the Megillah is midrabanan.
So it doesn't seem certainly doesn't come up in the Gemara here in this way. It's interesting also in the post scheme it does come up. When we get to the post scheme, you'll see that, I actually don't know if I included that source, but there are definitely some post scheme who say that Safek deraita l'chumra, Safek derabanan l'kula, that because it's the derabanan, we're going to be more makel. There are definitely post scheme who feel that way. Okay, let's jump ahead now and let's start to look in the post scheme. So if we look in the first, what is the issue? Why is this a question at all? What happens when you speak into a microphone or into the television? What's the difference between hearing me over as you all are and hearing me speak in person? So the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, who was the posek for Shaare Tzedek Hospital in Israel for many years, I think deals with this question. He's dealing with it in a hospital context, and we'll see what his answer is in a moment. But he explains what the issue is. So he was a posek who lived in the mid 20th century in Israel, passed away in the late 20th century. So he says, and I warned against it. He's speaking here about participating in a minyan not over the internet, but over a telephone or over the radio, and hinted that there was grave doubt if one fulfills their obligation of davening with a minyan when one listens over the radio. Because in truth, he says, one is not hearing the voice of the Shliach Tzibor, because his voice passes and it disappears, and it becomes a changing current, and the sound waves are transformed into electrical currents, and then again, those currents are changed back into air or sound waves, and then so that the sound that we hear is a sound that's really been recreated, so it sounds as though it's a human voice, even though he says it's not actually the human voice of the Shliach Tzibor, because it's gone through this transformational process. Right? It became some sort of electrical current, became particles, I guess, in some way to travel through our wires, and then the telephone or the radio, reassembles it into something that will then sound to us like the sound of a human voice. And that is the issue that he is concerned with, and that's the issue a lot of the poskim are concerned with.
I have a question.
Sure.
Does this have to do with the fact that you can listen to a woman singing indirectly, and so therefore, since that doesn't count, then this doesn't count either?
Yes, I think that is true. That if you are someone who thinks that the radio or any sort of amplification system is not really a human voice, you're going to probably be more inclined to say that Kol Isha, hearing a woman sing, is not an issue if you hear it through an amplification system, either radio or television or Zoom or a microphone. And if you're someone who thinks that, as we'll see, there are poskim who think that hearing the Megillah read through an amplification system is not a problem, like you said, Frank, then you're going to be more inclined, though, to be machmir, to be stringent in the case of whether or not Kol Isha, and thinking that it is really a human voice, and then maybe it's problematic. So the Minchas Eliezer, who passes away, I think in 1935, and was the Rebbe of Munkach. I know Frank's family came from Munkach. I think I'm sure there are probably some other people on the call whose families came from the Carpathian Mountains. Munkach was the big city there and the big Hasidic group there at the time in the early 20th century. So he was known actually for being generally very machmir, very stringent, and extremely anti-Zionist, but also a very important posek. So he, though, on this issue actually is pretty Mako, we might say today. I don't think he thought he was being necessarily Mako at the time. So he writes, if one hears, this is actually a tshuva where he's talking also about hearing, he actually discusses Kiddush first, which is sort of interesting. He says, if one hears Kiddush on the telephone, his friend will also fulfill his obligation if his table is set, even if he's several parsiot, let's say a kilometer or so away. But on Shabbos and Yantif, In any case, he says it's forbidden to speak on the telephone. So theoretically, though, if it weren't forbidden, if the telephone weren't asur on Shabbos, he says you could be yotzei someone who's in another house somewhere. Similarly, I was asked regarding Megillah whether one who hears it from another reading on the telephone fulfills his obligation. From all of the angles that the questioner probed, I still did not find reason to forbid it. This is because, in truth, the voice of the reading becoming thicker to one listening from afar does not disqualify the sound. So the Minchas Eliezer here thinks that Megillah is not, you can hear Megillah over the telephone. He doesn't think there's an issue. I think what he means by being thicker is this question of an echo that we saw raised in the Mishnah and in the Gemara. And presumably he's saying two things that relate to what we saw in the Megillah and in the Gemara. On the one hand, he's saying that the Gemara's concern about, on the one hand, I think the main thing he's saying actually is that this issue of hearing the echo, of hearing some sort of distortion in some way in the pure sound, that's really only a concern by shofar. And that's not a concern in terms of the Megillah. So he's reading the first sentence, the first phrase in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, about shofar and the echo as being exclusively about shofar. And then he says, then the Mishnah goes on and talks about shofar and Megillah Esther. But the Mishnah, he does not think, was concerned that one would hear, was not concerned about hearing a sort of distorted voice, an echo or a thickening of the sound when one hears Megillah. That alone would not be enough to disqualify the reading. And this idea also that the Gemara talks about, which is that maybe someone sort of has to be present, or they have to be theoretically able to hear the actual person's voice, even if they're hearing other things also. He also doesn't think that applies to the Megillah. Presumably, he thinks that only applies to the shofar. Scrolling back down. So now let's look at we're going to see here the opinion of the Chazon Ish as it appears in a tshuva from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, another very important 20th century posek in Israel. So we'll see what Rav Shlomo Zalman actually holds in a little bit. But here he's just quoting the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish, I believe, passed away in the 50s. But a very important posek, and also very important in terms of setting up the structure of the contemporary Haredi community in Israel. Famously, the Chazon Ish met with Ben Gurion, and formally or informally, depending on who you talk to, set up the structure basically that allows for Haredim to be deferred from the army, which obviously now is a very topic of a lot of contention in Israel and has been for years. Okay, so let's see what the Chazon Ish says here. So this is Rav Shlomo Zalman writing this. He says, after this article, the article that he wrote with his opinion was printed, I had the opportunity to speak with our teacher, the Chazon Ish, who told me that in his opinion, it is not so simple. It is possible that since the sound heard by the listener was produced by the one reading, and the sound is heard immediately, just like one who talks normally, perhaps this is considered like actually hearing it from the reader. And the same is true for one who hears the shofar blast directly from one who blows it, even if he uses a microphone or the like. According to this, we must say that when they said in the Gemara that if one hears the echo of the shofar, one has not fulfilled one's obligation, it is not because the sound is a different sound, it is because an echo is normally heard slightly later than the voice of the person, which is not true in the case of a telephone or a loudspeaker. So the Chazon Ish thought the issue with the echo wasn't that the sound wasn't the pure sound that initially came out of the shofar. Instead, he thought the issue was the delay, and that if you had on the telephone or with a sound system, if there's no delay, then it wouldn't be an issue. And he's also, unlike the Tzitz Eliezer, who is focused on the fact that the sound isn't the pure sound and it changes, it's transformed into electrical currents and then or radio waves and then gets reproduced as sound waves. The Chazon Ish doesn't seem to be concerned by that at all. He seems to have much more of to be focused much more on what our experience is of it. And the experience of it is that you're hearing someone's voice, just like your experience of this right now is hearing my voice, as if we were all in the Picholtz library in the shul. It doesn't. You don't think about how my voice is being is reaching you. So while the Chazon Ish doesn't necessarily seem to come out firmly in favor of using the telephone or the radio for a Megillah, or he doesn't come out firmly in terms of its permissibility, he certainly opens the door to the fact that that might be possible. And in fact, Rav Moshe Feinstein says something very similar. So Rav Moshe was also asked a question about, as we'll see, reading the Megillah over Zoom, and he hedges a bit, as we'll say. Concerning reading the Megillah via microphone, it's difficult to give a decisive halachic answer, since it has not been sufficiently clarified by reliable individuals how the sound is heard. Therefore, it is not appropriate to read the Megillah using a microphone. Even if we say that the experts are correct, the sound heard is not that of the person, but a different sound that emanates from his voice. Since the sound is heard only when he reads, one can still consider the sound to be his actual voice, as everything one hears is based on his actual voice. So again, Rav Moshe is saying, it's true what the Tzitz Eliezer wrote, that the sound isn't the pure sound, but experientially, it feels like it's the pure sound. And of course, the sound that comes out would only be possible if the Valkore, wherever he is, produced a sound initially. And what is the case of actual hearing, he says? Let's say you and I were in the same room. Maybe it is also in this manner, that some entity is created in the air and then reaches his ear. And this is also logical based upon what scientists say, that sound travels to the ears of others and also has a slight delay. But of course, even in person, you're never hearing something instantaneously with the moment it's being produced. But it is nevertheless still considered to be the voice of a person. Therefore, perhaps the sound transmitted through a microphone at the time one is speaking that others hear is also considered his actual voice. And this is more logical. For this reason, perhaps one needs not protest those who wish to read the Megillah with a microphone based upon halachic grounds. Nevertheless, though, so here he seems to be, again, not endorsing, but opening the door to the possibility that a microphone could be used. But then he continues, nevertheless, since the permissibility in this case is not clear, and this is a novel issue, one should protest to prevent them from chasing after other novel phenomena, after which people in these countries, and he was living in the United States, are so excited. So even, he says, theoretically, maybe it's permitted. He's not clear, he's not sure, but he doesn't think it's something that we should do because it's unclear, and he's concerned generally about, let's say, about too much innovation, or innovation leading to more radical innovation in what occurs, and the ways in which that can be destructive. And of course, we can think of examples where the slippery slope. Sometimes things are not the slippery. Sometimes the slippery slope rule doesn't apply. Right. And other times we can think of examples where it does, there actually was a slippery slope, and that seems to be part of his concern. Let's take a look at one other tshuva from Rav Moshe. So he talks though about a case where you can use the telephone for something. So he says, concerning Havdalah on the telephone, for a woman who is in the hospital, if she's unable to hear Havdalah where she is, she certainly could listen to it on the phone, since it's logical that she fulfills her obligation this way. As I wrote concerning reading the Megillah, the same is true about Havdalah, and one should likewise respond amen to a bracha heard over the telephone or microphone due to doubt. So it's interesting actually here with Havdalah, he seems much more open to it than he does with Megillah. It also might be, of course, that Megillah is something that's happening on a community level, as opposed to something that's happening privately, where someone is making Havdalah for a woman privately who's in the hospital who wouldn't otherwise be able to hear Havdalah. Of course, whenever we think about leniencies, I think one of the questions that does come up is that leniency for an individual or is that leniency for a community? And the tendency is to be more stringent on a communal level than for individuals. And I think that's good policy, and that's something we definitely see generally in the post game. I also let's look at the a final contemporary source, and then we'll discuss a little bit more, or two more sources. When there is the Tzitz Eliezer, who explained to us sort of how radio or telephone or even the internet works in terms of how a voice is picked up and then transformed and then reproduced. Does answer the question, and he sort of had to as the posek for Shari Tzedek, and he writes, when there is no other option, or in another case which I was asked about regarding a large hospital, where it was not possible to have the patients hear the Megillah without transmitting it via microphone, if a posek were in such a case permitted, even l'chadchila, we should not disparage his position. So it seems like the Tzitz Eliezer might not suggest this himself, but definitely under certain situations, he thinks it's a position that can be respected. I also think, actually, before we get to Rav Shlomo Zalman, I just want to go back and point something out, that if we look at someone put a question into the chat. So before I make my point, let me see, there was a question here. So Muriel asked, is Havdalah obligatory for a woman? That's a good question. The answer is yes, but you are right that maybe the answer, but it is very possible that the answer might be different for a man, because there's a question about what is the extent of a woman's obligation. Is it a deraisa obligation or derabanan obligation? Which is why women can make kiddush for men, but women shouldn't make Havdalah for men. It's possible that it, which sort of also goes back to something I think Adiv said, right? Which is maybe we're more makil in the case of derabanans. So that's a very good point also. The point I wanted to make before we looked at Rav Shlomo Zalman was going all the way back to the Minchas Eliezer. And that's the Minchas Eliezer was living in the early 20th century and appears to be pretty makil. And one of the questions I think that I have about his opinion, and I don't know that anyone's written about this, is that we know that Rav Shlomo Zalman, whose opinion we'll see in a second, and Rav Moshe Feinstein, whose opinion we just read, when they had questions about technology, they tended to consult with experts. They would ask people how this technology, if someone asked them a question about the telephone or the radio, they would ask people, how does this technology work? I'm not 100% sure that the Minchas Eliezer did that. He may have, but I don't know. And I think there are you do sometimes find a broader range of opinions about technology in early 20th century poskim than we might expect. In part because the poskim weren't 100% sure or didn't have a fully accurate view of how the technology actually worked. So like there are poskim who permit lights to be turned on, early 20th century poskim, not contemporary poskim, but who permit lights to be turned on Yontif, because they felt that just as you can transfer a flame on Yontif, right? If you have a candle lit on Yontif, you can take that candle and light another candle with it. They sort of conceptualized of electricity as being something like that. That, oh, there's a fire in the wall, And when I hit and that fire is already lit. And then when I hit the light switch, the fire moves to my light. And other poskim argued with them. And also as poskim developed a better understanding for the way the technology actually worked, they realized that conceptualization was not actually accurate or necessarily correct, and the halakha consensus moved in another direction. But there definitely are people who remember their from grandparents, let's say, right, using turning on lights, not turning off lights, but turning on lights on Yantif, because they had been taught with that sort of conceptualization in mind. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes views about technology change over time. And it can be first to a move towards stringency or leniency as poskim develop a better understanding of what's actually going on. So let's take a look at the opinion of Rav Shlomo Zalman now. We saw earlier that he quoted the Chazon Ish. Okay. So Rav Shlomo Zalman writes, based upon the entire description given about the mechanics of the electronic devices, it would seem that one who hears the sound of the shofar of the Megillah by phone or loudspeaker has not fulfilled one's obligation at all, since only hearing the sound of the shofar directly via vibrations in the air created by sound waves is considered hearing the shofar or the Megillah. So he understands the Mishnah's concern also about the echo that also apply to Megillah. This is not true when the ear hears the oscillations of the membrane, even though those vibrations also create similar sound waves, like the sound of the actual shofar, right? The membrane in the speaker. It is still logical that one is only hearing the sound of the vibrations from the membrane and not the sound of the shofar. I saw also in the Metzudat David of Rav Feldman, who writes in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, concerning whether a person is permitted to answer Amen after hearing another recite a bracha on the telephone. He says, see the response of the Minchas Eliezer, and we saw that, and other Achronim that discuss this. But according to the ideas that we have suggested earlier, it would seem that hearing in this manner has the status of waving the scarves that took place in Alexandria of Egypt, which was and we saw that Gemara. And you might have thought based on that Gemara that you don't have to be in the same place, or you don't actually have to hear the sound of the person. You don't actually have to hear the sound of the person's voice who's making the bracha in order to answer Amen. So Rav Shlomo Zalman, though, has a different take on what that Gemara is saying, which was considered knowing which bracha the Chazan was reciting, but no more. Accordingly, it seems that one should not recite Amen on a bracha in which he is obligated to fulfill an obligation. So one, he would disagree with the Minchas Eliezer that you could hear Kiddush being recited over the telephone or something like that, putting the Shabbos issues aside, because we all have an obligation in Kiddush. And even concerning a bracha that the listener is not obligated to recite to fulfill an obligation, it is also possible that only one standing outside a shul or even nearby and hears the repetition of the chazan or other brachot via an amplifier should follow the congregation and respond Amen, since it is like Alexandria in Egypt. But this is not the case when one stands far away and hears a bracha over the telephone, where it seems, in my humble opinion, that one should not answer Amen at all on any bracha, and one who does answer is considered to have responded Amen in vain, since he hears the bracha from a membrane and not from the person. So Rav Shlomo Zalman thinks that in general, one can't fulfill their obligation. Should not answer Amen to a bracha that they don't hear the person recite, if it's something that if it's something for which they have an obligation, that if it's like Kiddush or Havdalah or something like that. If you hear an example of a bracha where the listener doesn't have the obligation would be like at a wedding. The listeners don't have any obligation, any of the mitzvot that are going on under the chuppah. they don't have an obligation to recite any of those brachot, but they hear it, so they answer Amen. And Rav Shlomo Zalman is saying, because you're physically close to that, to what's actually happening, because you are connected in some way, you could answer Amen. But if you were watching a wedding happen over Zoom, then you shouldn't. I know someone put something in the chat when I was about halfway through this, so let me pull that up. Okay, so I'm glad Adiv asked that LED is not a filament burning and is different, perhaps. Adiv, do you want to explain that a little bit more? I mean, I think you were talking about our lights today.
Right. You mentioned that in the early century they allowed on Yom Tov to turn on the light, but basically it's a burning filament inside the bulbs that they use at that time. Today the LED is really emission, so it's a different kind. You don't burn any filament.
Right. So in fact, I think that today definitely there are poskim who I think say you can be more lenient than when our light bulbs had filaments. And I have to say, as we started to talk about this, I was wondering if there were people who had more sort of expertise in the way in which radio waves work, high-speed internet works, because the changing technology also is definitely going to affect how poskim think about this issue, and I think it already is with LED and issues with the rise of LED lights. That generally the poskim are saying that in most cases we treat them just like the traditional lights that had a filament, but certainly there are poskim who are saying that in certain situations of need, and on an individual level, not on a communal level, there are definitely poskim who are being more makil in certain instances because the technology is changing, and a filament a burning filament is a pretty clear doraita, a Torah violation, and an LED is not that.
As far as the sound now, because they are using fiber optics, so the distortion of the voice is so minimal, unlike a copper wires. So
right.
The transmission is much clearer than copper wires. So I don't know.
So it's also interesting to think about that as our technology, like you said, improves. Let's say with fiber optic, it might. If the concern is that the voice is distorted, maybe that's no longer an issue. I don't know if the concern is there's a delay. If there's a delay on your internet feed, now you're in trouble, right? Because that was one concern that some of the poskim raised. Or if Rav Shlomo Zalman, though, I think does say that the issue is not the distortion or a delay. The issue is that you're listening to a reproduced voice. In which case, even with fiber optics, he would still say that you haven't fulfilled your obligation.
Yeah, I just puzzled why they haven't mentioned the actual bracha, which is on Megillah. We say Mikra Megillah. So now we have obligation to read the Megillah ourselves. On the shofar, we have just to listen. So there is a quite a difference. So, and if we don't fulfill on Mikra Megillah, so what is the problem listening to the Megillah over the phone?
So the problem is one, the Shulchan Aruch says that if you can't hear Megillah in person and you can't read it from a cloth, you should read it from a chumash, but without a bracha. So certainly that's you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah in its fullest sense, but the Shulchan Aruch definitely says you should do that. and um, and it sounds like and I think Rosh Shlomo Zalman would say if you're listening to it on Zoom or online, you also haven't fulfilled it. You haven't fulfilled the mitzvah to hear Megillah as well. And you'll see there are poskim now who are saying that let's say you don't even that you should follow along if you're going to be at home, that you can't read it for yourself fully, that you should follow along and sort of read it in an undertone as you hear it being read over the phone or online. But ideally, you should be doing that from a kosher cloth. And actually, I think that's what my in-laws did last year in New Rochelle. There's another piece to this that I want to talk about just for a moment, and then we'll look at one more posek who talks, very contemporary posek, talks about COVID directly at the very end. So Rav Ovadia Yosef deals with another question that was sort of hinted at before, and that's what if there's an amplification system, but you're also present, like if there's a microphone in the room. So he writes, it seems that with regard to those who sit close to the Chazan and would have been able to hear the Megillah without, would have been able to hear the Megillah read well from the Chazan's mouth, even without the loudspeaker, it is logical that they fulfill their obligation. And even if the voice of the Chazan sounds deeper or stronger because of the loudspeaker, it is not a problem, since ultimately those in the congregation sitting nearby hear the Megillah from one who is obligated, and all sounds are valid. In summary, those who hear the Megillah reading from a loudspeaker or radio do not fulfill their obligation, but those who sit close to the Chazan, who reads the Megillah using a loudspeaker, do fulfill their obligation, since they can hear the Megillah reading from the Chazan even without the loudspeaker. And this almost seems to be like the Gemara talking about the person who's in the pit when the shofar is being blown. And even though, because theoretically you could have heard the Chazan read the Megillah, even though you're hearing it sort of better, fuller, with the help of a microphone, Rav Ovadia says you have fulfilled your obligation. And I have to admit, because this still ensures that everyone is physically present, which I do think is part of the concern of the poskim, that people won't be physically present. And also because there's the theoretical possibility that there's the likelihood that they would be able to hear the Chazan as well. They have to theoretically have been able to hear the Chazan, or the Baal Koreh rather, read the Megillah. I'm sort of, I find this, what Rav Ovadia here is saying to be pretty persuasive. And I could see where having an amplification system might make the Megillah reading easier for people. Certainly this year we're going to be having a Megillah reading outside. We're not going to use a microphone, but I have to admit I sort of wrestled with that issue because I think Rav Ovadia makes a very strong argument here that if they would have been able to hear it without the microphone, just because it helps them hear it, certainly doesn't take away from the mitzvah in any way at all. I think, did someone have something else in the chat?
No, сегодня нет никакого Megillah reading.
Sorry, say that one more time. Okay, so someone asked, is there a problem using a hearing aid? It's not a simple question, but actually, and I think most poskim though actually would sort of use Rav Ovadia's framework as a jumping off point, which is that if you can hear the Megillah without a hearing aid, you're better off hearing the Megillah without a hearing aid, and because of Rav Shlomo Zalman's opinion, and if that's at all possible, that's better. If you really can't hear the Megillah, if you're going to take your hearing aids out and not be able to hear anything, then you should leave your hearing aids in. because of course there are poskim who say that you can fulfill your obligation even through an amplification system. And I'll just add that I've seen around the shul, I know there are people who do both, that there are some people in the shul who take out their hearing aids for the Megillah, and they sit very close and focus to ensure that they hear every word. Obviously, they have some level of natural hearing, and there are other people I know who wouldn't hear anything otherwise, and they leave their hearing aids in. And it really depends on what your situation is and what your experience would be like if you didn't have your hearing aids in. So Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon is a very contemporary posek. He lives in, I believe he lives in Alon Shvut in Israel. And he dealt with this question directly for our present moment. Poskim disagree as to whether hearing a loudspeaker or listening to Zoom is considered to be the same as hearing a human voice, despite the fact that this is not the person's true voice. Rav Shlomo Zalman and other poskim hold that this is not his voice, and one cannot fulfill a halachic obligation in this manner. And the same conclusion, he says, is reached by Rav Avadia, and we saw those all those opinions. However, some hold that this is considered to have the status of a human voice. Right? Rav Moshe, the Tzitz Eliezer, we saw those as well. Even if we say that one does not fulfill one's obligation when hearing the Megillah read via the internet, it is logical that there is still an advantage to doing so with regard to the idea of reading it in public and publicizing the miracle. Since the more the one is connected to the prayer of the congregation, there is an advantage. So Yosef Tzvi Rimon doesn't say that you have fulfilled your obligation. Sort of a hedge here as well. It's a machlokes poskim. The dominant opinion on this is like Rav Shlomo Zalman. That is traditionally how the Orthodox world has poskim. That you don't, one does not fulfill their obligation by hearing Megillah read through any sort of amplification system. There are definitely, as we've seen, there are poskim who've disagreed, but Rav Shlomo Zalman's opinion is sort of where the consensus lies. But I think and certainly that is the way that that's the way that I hold, and that's the way I've thought about what we're doing this year at the shul. At the same time, I do think there's as Rav Rimon says, there are lots of reasons, even if one can't totally fulfill their obligation to hear Megillah over Zoom, there are lots of reasons to still broadcast it. One is Persumei Nisa. One is because anytime you're doing something in concert with the tzibur, there's a benefit, right? Even when our shuls were closed, people said there was still a benefit to everyone davening at the same time, even if they were in different locations. And of course, I think those are halachic considerations. And there's also the emotional impact of being able to be connected to the community, even if it's only remotely. So for all those reasons, we are broadcasting. We'll have 2 Megillah readings over Zoom, even though I don't think one actually fulfills their obligation this way. And for people who are unable to come, this is God willing, there'll be opportunities in future years for us all to gather and hear Megillah together. But for those who are able to leave their homes, they should come to shul to hear the Megillah read. I want to finish off with one more contemporary source. Rav Hershel Schachter also says something similar. Rav Hershel Schachter, who's the foremost modern Orthodox posek in the US, said, he suggested, actually, I didn't include this part because it was sort of off our topic, but he suggested that if people were worried about, if the concern was having too many people in shul at once, he suggested that you start having Megillah readings earlier in the evening. That the earliest time, he said, you could actually read Megillah is after Plag HaMincha, which is about 90 minutes or so before sunset, if you need to, he said. So he suggested that you really start Megillah readings much earlier, and then you could have very small crowds spaced out. But then he writes, if there's absolutely no other choice, one may be lenient and rely upon the possibility suggested by Rav Moshe, where he's uncertain about the nature of the halacha of one not fulfilling one's obligation when hearing the sound of an echo. If it is because it is not the original sound, or because the sound is not so clear. The practical difference between the two is when hearing via microphone, a phone or microphone, it is not its original sound, but the sound is clear. The Chazon Ish and our teacher, Rav Soloveitchik, were also uncertain about this. Rav Shlomo Zalman held that there is no uncertainty here at all, and one certainly does not fulfill one's obligation. So Rav Schechter is saying because the poskim themselves are not certain, one should not rely on hearing Megillah read over Zoom. So again, there's, for people who are not able to leave their home and not able to join this, certainly there are poskim who suggest that Zoom or hearing Megillah read remotely might work. But for anyone who's able to come to shul, they should come to shul, and in that way fully, certainly fulfill their obligation of hearing the Megillah read on Torah. So I'll open it up there for questions. I think someone put something in the chat. What is the difference between hearing aids and wearing glasses?
My question relates to the fact, let's say if I'm reading the Torah and I'm using heavy glasses, I may not see the actual letters exactly as they are shaped. Maybe I will see only part of the word and guess what it is if I am a very good learner. So what is the difference between reading with eyeglasses compared to hearing the Megillah with hearing aids? There's hardly any difference from the practical point of view.
I think that the difference is, and I'm not sure this will be entire, I understand why this might not be entirely convincing, but the difference is that the difference, I assume, someone like Rav Shlomo Zalman would say, is that the image entering your eye hasn't changed really in its essence in any way. It hasn't been transformed into one thing and then recreated back into an image your eye can see. The glasses sort of amplify it, right? That maybe that basically your prescription glasses are a really good magnifying lens, and so but it never stopped being what it was, became something else, and then was reconverted back into something that you could see. I guess a sort of something I hadn't thought of before, but might be more akin to glasses, is what if we, and I haven't seen a posek talk about this, but maybe the Baal Koreh could use one of those old style bullhorns, right, where there's no electronic piece to it at all, and it's just something that they're blowing out and they're speaking into, right? I think that would be more akin to glasses.
I think one of the sources there talked about a megaphone.
It did talk about a megaphone, but I think, I could be wrong, I think that was an electronic megaphone.
So, Rabbi?
Yes.
So all of these poskim, with the exception of Rabbi Rimon and Rabbi Schechter, which, who are here and now and living through COVID, I don't, I just, for me personally, I feel like one would, there are so many instances people wouldn't have been able to learn Torah this year without Zoom. You wouldn't have been able to do so many other things, that to say you're not fulfilling your obligation if you're still a little freaked out about doing those, you know what I mean, like coming to shul, it doesn't, you know what I mean? I feel like it's extenuating circumstances. And I feel like it, piggybacking on what Adiv said, it's in the dryer, that like the mechanisms are so sophisticated today, the technology, that, you know, is it really distorted? Is it not really distorted? I don't know. It just seems to me, and I know we know that there are post-scheme who are saying, you know, people who are coming up with saying that it is okay and you are fulfilling your obligation, but I don't know. I just sort of feel like it's extenuating this year, like for me personally. And I also don't see the connection between the shofar and the Megillah because of muksa. I mean, you wouldn't be doing it anyway. Like, you know what I'm saying? And Megillah.
Okay, so I think the one for sure, in many ways, this year has been very challenging and difficult in lots of ways. I think it's been more bearable in many ways because we have had Zoom and technology, and we've been able to stay connected. So I don't think I certainly, and I've enjoyed teaching over Zoom and being able to see people over Zoom. So I don't mean to take away from Zoom at all. I think there are certain mitzvot that really have to be done in person, and it might be at times that we can't be there in person to do them, and then we've missed out on a chance to do a mitzvah in its fullest fashion, and God willing, we'll have future opportunities. So I don't think that there's a I understand why people are nervous, and why people are scared to gather again. But at the same time, I think that it doesn't take away from the fact. But at the same time, there are mitzvot that really have to be done in person, and that the consensus in the posting goes from people who say it definitely has to be heard in person to people who say they're uncertain about technology, so we shouldn't rely on it. So that's sort of those are the major post-scheme, and that's why I think you're seeing such a push. So I'm encouraging it. I know other shul rabbis are, for people to come into shul. I also think, just as a sort of a policy thing aspect of this, I think maintaining community and in-person community is very important, and that I do worry about the long-term ramifications of using Zoom or technology to try to create a sense of community. I don't think it does I don't think it's up to the task.
Thank you.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Because we went through several opinions of individual rabbis. I would say if we had this time with the COVID, let's say 10 rabbis coming together and issuing a clearance to hear it through Zoom, would that, in your mind, will hold?
If we had,
I'm not talking about Sanhedrin. I'm talking about just 10 rabbis from different groups who come together. Would that will hold?
so it's hard to. I would be hesitant. It's hard to answer that question sort of in abstract, but I would be hesitant to. I would be hesitant to do it. I think Zoom has all sorts of good attributes and uses, but I don't think it's a replacement for hearing something in person or being part of something in person. And
so how about microphone?
A microphone. So I do think for me, I think there's a difference there. I think that Rav Avadia's position, in some ways I find more compelling than, in Rav Avadia's position I find particularly compelling. And that's that if you're present, so that you could theoretically hear it, so long as you're present and you could theoretically hear it, even if something helps you hear better, then it's not. Then it could be used. I have to admit, I wasn't prepared to do that this year in the shul, but I do find it sort of as an argument. I find it compelling.
Rabbi, I see another issue. It's whether or not a person physically could go to hear the Megillah, or, for example, in my own situation, I'm locked in. It's not possible for me to come, even if I wanted to. And suppose somebody here in the building was so disabled that they could not come. Why should they have to feel that they've not fulfilled the mitzvah?
So I think that's exactly why we are showing it on Zoom, and I think there is that really is the case, that those opinions who are lenient, I really think that is the case that they're talking about. I don't know what Rosh Shlomo Zalman would say to that, but I think that's exactly the example that Tzitz Eliezer was talking about. And I think even though it wasn't the situation that we saw in Rav Moshe Feinstein's tshuva, my sense is that that's a case where he would say it certainly makes sense as well.
There is I don't know if you heard of Machon Lev in Israel that is specializing in developing techniques how to use technology within the halacha, and different things that they develop in order to enable in Shat Charum, in an emergency, to use technology, because that's the only way to communicate. They developed a telephone for the hospitals to use that uses grammar. It has a time delay. So it's not like you speak and the other side can hear. There is a time delay for the other side. So they went around that the issue of hearing it directly. But I didn't hear them coming up with okay for doing. And in Israel, there's a lot of people that need to use Zoom. The only answer they gave in Israel is you have to hear the Megillah. You go outside to the porch and somebody reads it, and all the neighbors can hear one from the other. That's as close as you can get in Israel to hear the Megillah in person. Machon Lev did not give a heter, and this is the Rabbanim from Gush Etzion. They did not give a heter to use Zoom in Israel for that purpose. So if they didn't come up with a solution, we're using Zoom. The only thing is people in the nursing homes and people in big communities, and they cannot go out. And I know it's here as well. The closest they can get to hear the Megillah is on not only Zoom, not only the Zoom, but I was thinking that people that are hearing impaired, they need to see the people, the Balkore's lips moving to actually be able to understand what he's saying. And the Zoom is not only the voice, but also seeing the Balkore. That helps them. That helps them a lot. That fulfills to them. They understand. They can hear the Megillah even better because they can see that the person, the Balkore, lips moving, and they can interpret exactly what is laying.
So I think just to summarize and then wrap up, and I know someone asked me a question about how the outdoor Megillah reading is going to use tomorrow. So to summarize again, there are some poskim who are there are some poskim, like the Minchas Eliezer we saw is sort of totally accepts this idea. There are many poskim, the Chazon Ish, Rav Moshe, the Tzitz Eliezer, who are uncertain. and they reserve this because they're uncertain. They say only someone in case of great need, like Dr. Cohen mentioned, I think a very powerful example of that, right? Someone who can't leave, or someone who's unable physically to get to shul. So they said only someone in great need should rely on this. And then you have Rav Shlomo Zalman, who feels like this is a non-starter for anyone. And that Rav Rimon and Rav Schechter say that someone in great need can rely on this, but everyone else who is able to come to shul should come to shul. For Megillah reading at the shul, we have lots of different options. If you have questions or you're interested in additional Megillah readings, let me know. The outdoor reading we have will be in our parking lot. A few people, some of whom I know are on this call, so, have asked if they can sit in their cars. If you already asked me and I said yes, the answer is still yes. We have had a very good turnout from across the community. So I've asked people not to be in their cars, except for the handful of people who already spoke with me. So because if there are too many people in their cars, no one will be able to hear anything. So that's the way it will work tomorrow. If you're coming to the late Megillah readings, if you're coming to the women's reading, especially, please park in the church parking lot. The front door of the shul will be open around 7:45, so you can come in the front door. That way it will allow people from the earlier reading to leave out the back door, and there won't be a lot of congestion in the shul parking lot. And I think that should answer all of the logistical questions for tomorrow. Are there any more questions? Okay. It was good to see everyone. Thank you for the lively discussion. And
Thank you, Rabbi.
I understand people are nervous about coming back to shul, and that it will take time before people feel comfortable. But we've done everything we can in terms of working with the medical committee also. And I really appreciate Dr. Worthington, Dr. Altos, Dr. Shafran, and Dr. Rothberg, who worked with me and Frank to make sure that also for those who are coming to shul, that it is a safe environment. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bill?